Michael Alm here. So this week I'm not in my workshop, I'm actually at a client's house. I'm working on a built-in bedroom. So this is going to be a Murphy bed, but it's also going to have a bedside table and a bunch of features like LED lighting and stuff like that. I'm excited to share this build with you guys because if you've ever considered making a built-in, a lot of the same techniques are going to apply. You can never really trust a wall to be perfectly flat and plumb, so I like to design my built-ins with basically like a false wall somewhere. It's something that I can build up off of that I know is perfectly plumb, flat, level, true. That's what I'm doing right here. I'm peeling away this baseboard so that I can put in some framing lumber so that I have something to rely on for the rest of the build. So I'm just using some regular framing lumber on this, and you can see my laser level is a super handy tool to have, but you can always just use a standard level to do this sort of stuff. And then I'm setting up this wall so that it's nice and parallel to the bookcase on the right-hand side. I'm referencing everything off of that bookcase. And now I'm building a soffit. I designed this soffit basically to bring the height down so that the bed kit would fit properly. It also allows me to run electrical inside of the ceiling. This is a handy trick if you don't know it. If you don't have an extra set of hands on a job site, you can just cut a 2x4 to the correct height and it can hold things up to the ceiling for you. Once the soffit was in place, I could remove it, and I noticed that one of the sides was kind of twisted a bit, so I just took a piece of scrap wood and used it as a lever arm, and then twisted it back so it was nice and plumb. When I came back to the job site the second day, I realized that 2x4 was too thick. I needed to reduce it because I'm going to be putting a piece of MDF over the surface of it so that I could have a paintable surface there. So that was a super easy fix. I just replaced the 2x4 with a 1x4 and I could keep going with the framing. So I added this cleat to the back, which basically just gives me something to nail the ceiling onto. And again, I checked it for level. I'll secure one screw in the center and then level it out and then secure multiple screws from there. Then I also wanted to make sure that the back and the front were coplanar, and they weren't. There was a little dip in the center. So I was able to screw up into the ceiling studs and kind of bring that section up just a little bit. And then I could use my big level to make sure it was nice and flat. With the soffit leveled out, I could start framing up the right-hand wall. And this is a really shallow wall. I just needed enough space for an electrical wire to be hidden inside. I also added a piece of 3/4 inch plywood at the bottom. This is because the bed hardware sits right up against this wall, and I want to make sure it was nice and strong. So now you can see that MDF piece, which is going to get painted. This is why I changed out that board. And then I'm just building a little bit of structure so that I have something to nail the ceiling into. Since this is a ceiling and it's going to be above people's heads, I decided that I would just screw those in as well. They probably would have been fine with the nails, but this just makes sure that they're extra secure. So the next day, my buddy Josh came over to help with the electrical. I'm not an electrician, but Josh is, and he actually runs a lighting design company. So he sort of talked me through all the steps that I needed to know in order to run the electrical, and he helped me out throughout the whole build. So one of the things that he told me was that I don't need to break into these walls. Basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a little false wall that hides all the electrical and the drivers that control the LEDs. So now that we had a plan, we could actually start organizing wires and figuring out where the power was going to come from. The main source of power is going to be this outlet right here, and Josh put an extension on it so that we can lock it in underneath the bedside table, but we didn't need this second outlet. This is going to be behind a plywood panel, and so what I did was I cut out the drywall around it just enough to get this cover plate to sit nice and flush to the surface of the wall. With Josh's instructions, I was able to plan out all the wiring. These are low voltage wires because they're only controlling LEDs. This one's gonna go to a bedside table lamp that isn't made yet, so it's not actually gonna be included in this build, but we just buried that wire in the wall for later use. The rest of the electrical is gonna sit above the bedside table. And so I'm just putting in a little block here so that I can have a place to anchor a 3-gang box. I need a switch for the headboard light, a switch for the soffit light, and a place to put an outlet. I put in this little spacer block to make sure that the 3-gang box was nice and centered, and then I could secure the 3-gang box with some screws. I had to trim out some sections using my multi-tool to just get some areas where the cords can go. This one's gonna light up the headboard, and this wire is for the soffit light. I notched out this lower section so I could collect all those wires back to that original main source of the power. And again, secured all the wires with staples. And with all the low voltage secured, now I could bring up the Romex, which brings power to the switches. Whenever I work on a job site, I try and pre-cut as much material as possible. And in this case, I measured out all of the panels that I needed to cover that space and cut them in my shop, just because it's way easier to maneuver in there, and it's definitely way easier to throw them in the back of old gold. With that said, I don't usually like to cut the panels perfectly to size because I like to scribe the back wall. Again, that wall is not super flat, so I use a scribe, draw a line, and then trim it to fit. The other thing that I like to do is I leave the front long, so I can trim that flat at the very end, so I can actually take a couple tries with the scribing. With that front edge trimmed, I can be pretty confident that it's going to be perfectly flush every single time. And then the other panel, which was a little bit more complicated because I had to cut open a space for the electrical box, but it's not too bad. You just kind of measure off of the floor, off of the walls, and make sure that it's nice and tight. I also needed to cut out a relief notch for the electrical. That one's for the soffit, and this one's for the headboard. And then I could secure it into place. The next panel to go in was the ceiling panel, and in order to get this really nice and tight, I again scribed to the back edge, but it was so wobbly that I had to use a jigsaw for it. One of the things that I like to do with a jigsaw is tilt it back, because jigsaws never really cut straight, and I'd rather cut away excess material on the side that's not seen than have that stick out and cause an unwanted gap. With that in the right spot, I traced out the spots where I had structure and then just applied a bunch of glue to that. Again, it's a ceiling, so I want to make sure that it doesn't fall. So I ended up gluing it on and putting a few nails in it to make sure it was nice and flush. So all of the surfaces outside of this Builtin are going to be painted, and for that I like to use MDF. MDF stands for medium density fiberboard. It is basically a whole bunch of sawdust that's been glued together. It doesn't have any structure, but it's great for painting on. So I secured those. You can see I glued that edge that meets up with the walnut ply because I wanted that to be nice and tight. I didn't have space to put wood filler in, so I just wanted to make sure that I got a really nice tight joint there. The next element to build is the floor, and I'm using my improvised workshop out here in this beautiful back patio from my client's house. This was my setup, and I'm not complaining. So the floor is made up of a series of strips that they're just scraps that I had left over from cutting the walnut panels. And all I'm doing is gluing and nailing these pieces in. This isn't gonna take a lot of weight. It's really just the base for the bedside table. The bed doesn't actually secure to this at all, so nobody's ever gonna stand on it. It's just a really basic structure that essentially is just a toe kick. With the frame built, I could nail it to the sidewalls, and I just used a little 3/4 inch spacer because I'm gonna have a strip of walnut that goes across the front of it, and that's 3/4 of an inch. I did add liquid nails underneath certain sections of it because there's a little bit of a dip in the floor, and I didn't want this thing to squeak at all if anyone did actually end up stepping on it. So I glued down the surface panel. This is actually what's gonna get finish applied to it. And then I can add that solid piece of walnut as the toe kick. The last little bit of walnut plywood that I needed to cover up the end grain of is up here. And this is actually, it's set back because it's where the bed rests up against. So I just added a little 1/4 inch piece of walnut to there. After that, I could use my Mirka sander to clean up all the edges and make sure that everything is nice and flush. It made short work of it. And then I could start applying finish. I wanted to get to this pretty early because I knew I wanted at least 4, maybe 5 coats on this thing. And so every time I was on the job site, I would just apply another coat at the end of the day. So gradually building it up. I was also working on the bedside table while I was building up this finish. So it's kind of an order of operations thing. You can see this is the first coat and it looks kind of splotchy, and it'll get better and better. So while that finish was being applied, I was also working in my shop. I built the bedside table, which is its own video. If you haven't seen that yet, that is already on my channel. This is the headboard that I'm working on that matches up to that bedside table. And the main little design feature that I was adding in was this sapwood inlay. So this is also walnut, it's walnut sapwood, and I'm lining it up right with the sapwood inlay that I put on the bedside table. I trimmed out that top edge with another piece of sapwood, and I was able to use my rockler bandy clamps to hold them into place. With my palm sander, I sanded everything nice and flush. And then I was ready to cut out for the bedside table. So I made sure that the bedside table was nicely aligned with that new inlay. This was definitely a nerve-wracking cut because if it's off by even 1/32 of an inch, you're gonna notice it. So I took my time, I labeled everything. I have a tendency to just cut right through parts if I don't label them because of muscle memory. So I made sure and put that blue tape on, which helped a lot. And then I cut the back of it at a 15-degree angle. This was actually specified by the manufacturer of the Murphy bed hardware. So if you guys remember, and you've seen that bedside table build, I made a little void in the back, and that's because I discovered that even though I put a lot of effort into trying to make those walls coplanar, they were not perfect. So I had to trim out the side of this cabinet. It was a little bit of brute force just to get this done. I had to use the tools I had on the job site. I didn't really think this through very well, but I managed to get through it with a couple of old chisels that I usually just use as pry bars, so it worked. In order to secure the bedside table to the floor, I decided to use dominoes. You could use dowels if you have dowel jigs. Domino is just such a quick way to do this kind of work and super strong. So if you haven't heard of a domino, it's basically a floating tenon that you can put in pretty much anywhere. You draw a line and you put these little dominoes into the hole, and it lines everything up super nicely. The next element to install was this back panel, and this again is the reason why I had to cover up that outlet. And then with that in place, I could add in the Murphy bed hardware. This is a kit that comes from murphybeds.com. You guys may have seen the other Murphy bed video that I put out, and that one I installed the rockler hardware kit. I've had good experience with the rockler hardware kit. The reason I didn't use the rockler one on this one is because it wasn't gonna actually fit with the bedside table that I designed. The piston was actually gonna sit above it. This is a spring actuated system as opposed to the rockler one, which is a air piston. My experience with the Murphy bed system is generally pretty good. I think the instruction manual's really cryptic and hard to get through, but when it comes to the mechanism, it worked great. So the next day, Josh came back to help me install the lighting. He's working on the headboard light. This is gonna go behind the headboard and uplight that wall. Again, it's very nice to have an electrician on site to problem solve things. I'm not an electrician, and I like to have someone who has a little bit more experience with it on the site, so make sure that everything's nice and safe. We secured that cleat into the studs and tested it out, and it worked great. So now it was time to secure the headboard. These are just some little cleats that I made. I decided to, it was really hard to figure out a way you couldn't get screws in behind there. I didn't want hardware on the surface, so I just made these little blocks and added dominoes into the headboard and the blocks themselves. This was a quick little jig so that I had something to hold the part. I just nailed it off to my sawhorse. With those made, I could screw them into the bedside table and the right side wall. I also added a little nailer onto the left-hand side wall to make sure that that left side of the headboard wasn't floating in space. I could then tap in the dominoes into the cleat and slide the headboard into place. Took a little bit of maneuvering to get it all to lock in, but once it was locked in, it was really nice and strong. One thing I did notice was that the center of the headboard was kind of wobbly, so I made this wedge piece that I just glued against the back side of the headboard. Back in my workshop, I started making the panels that are gonna go on the outside of this Murphy bed. I want the whole outside to be painted, so I'm using this material called Armor Core. It's MDF on the face and plywood on the inside. I edge banded that with some poplar edge banding, and then I could sand it flush and get it ready for veneering. I'm going to be veneering just one of these panels, and it's going to be the door that covers up the bedside table. I haven't done a lot of veneering, but I watched a couple videos by John Peters. He's got a bunch of videos on how to veneer. I'll put links down below. But the basics of it are you just add a contact cement to both the surface of the plywood as well as the surface of the veneer. Once you have both surfaces completely covered in the contact cement and they're nice and dry, you can bring them together. And I used these strips just to keep the contact cement off of both panels while I'm aligning it. This stuff is, as soon as it sticks, it is stuck. It's not coming back up. So you got to be really careful with it. Take your time and get it aligned really, really nicely. You want to apply a good bit of pressure as you're going and make sure that you're not getting any air bubbles underneath the surface. After that, you come back with a board and kind of burnish it out. Make sure that there's absolutely no place where it hasn't come into contact. And then you can flip it over and trim off the excess. I just used a razor knife for this with a nice sharp new blade in it. After that, I sand the edge down, make sure that there's nothing that's overhanging, and then I can start applying finish. Other than this door panel, I need 2 more panels that I cut out and primed. These will make up the bed panels, the actual panel that the bed goes on. Back at the job site, I took those bed panels and dominoed the sides of them so I could bring them together. In the instructions, they have you keep these two apart, but my client requested it to be one panel. So in order to do that, I think it's something like 60 inches wide, so a 4x8 sheet is not wide enough to make it up. So I ended up gluing it together. This went pretty well. Fortunately, the structure of the bed hardware actually pulls it into square, so I didn't have to worry too much about it. I also left them long so that once they're glued up, I could cut them down to length. With the panel all glued up, I could lay out the hardware for the kit. The kit comes with some super strong rails that manage to pull that plywood nice and flat, and a ton of screws that you screw in along the whole length of it. It also comes with corner brackets that hold the corners nice and tight. The kit also comes with this aluminum stiffener that'll pull any sort of belly or sag out of the middle of the panel. With the bed panel complete, we were ready to set up to install it. And in order to do that, you pull back the tension arm and it has this little lock that holds the arm in place. And then you're ready to go. So we brought in the panel, definitely needed an extra set of hands for this, so thank you, Josh. And you lift it up and it has like a little catch there, which you later add a couple bolts to. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty easy to install. I sanded up that glue seam that was formed from the glue up. And then I was able to prep the door. I used this little jig from Craig. It's a really convenient jig that I wish I had a long time ago. It's made for European style hinges and makes it super simple. And the number one question that I got when I was building this bedside table was why I needed that cutout in there. And this is why. It was made for the inset hinges because the door frame actually sits on the inside of that bedside table. The next little detail is to add in the soffit light cover. This was just made out of a couple of pieces of wood, walnut in the front, and it's set at just like a 15-degree angle. This just gives a little bit of shielding, so if you were to look up at the light, you don't see the actual light fixture itself. With that installed, I was able to start prepping for paint. When it comes to something like this, I don't take any risks. It seems like if I ever leave anything exposed, paint gets on it. So I covered every single surface of this, took my time with the edges of stuff and made sure that everything was nice and burnished so paint would not get underneath it. I also caulked all the joints where the wall met the face of the built-in. I started off with a primer and primed all of the exposed MDF. And then went over the top of that with 3 coats of wall paint. Fortunately, the client had the original paint from the rest of the room, so it was easy to match. And now it's just down to the final touches. I reinstalled the door and added a door pull. And added in the foot hardware for the Murphy bed. With that, it was all done. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching, and if you got any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments down below. If you want to know what tools that I used, all of them are linked in the description down below, and if you want to watch some more videos, here's a playlist right here. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. You support me every single month, and if you've been following along, watching a bunch of my videos and learned a bunch of stuff, maybe consider kicking in a couple bucks and joining the Patreon crew. There's exclusive SketchUp files on there, there's a bunch of rewards, exclusive stickers, all sorts of things. Really appreciate it, and I'll catch you on the next one.